Yeah.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. Wherever you are watching us from, on behalf of the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement and the Water Policy Center, it gives me a great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished speakers, chair, and participants those who have joined this session. To chair this session, we have Professor Maxim Khomyakov with us today. It is my great pleasure to introduce the chair. Professor Maxim Khomyakov is a professor at the Higher School of Economics, National Research University, Saint-Petersburg, Russia, and founding director of BRICS Studies Center at the Ural Federal University. He was a vice president, international affairs at Ural Federal University, Ekaterinburg, Russia from 2009 up to 2017. Professor Khomyakov was a visiting scholar at Texas University, USA, and European University Institute, Italy. Since 2015, Professor Khomyakov has been actively involved in establishing university collaboration in BRICS country, and especially in stabilizing the BRICS Network University. Professor Khomyakov is a head of Russian National Coordinating Committee and a member of BRICS Network University. His research interests include theory of modernity, theory of toleration, Russian philosophy of 19th century, and higher education theory. His works include several books and more than 60 scholarly articles. Without extending further, let me request Professor Maxim Khomyakov to take charge of the session.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for presentation. I will try to, well, in my kind of opening remarks, I will try to be as short and concise as possible to give floor to the speakers and provide some space also for questions and answers. Well, I just comment a bit about current trends, which about our time and current events, trends we are experiencing now, which we are living through now. Well, I think speaking about the world order, one of the most important things is, of course, the rise of the global south, the current rise of the global south and the crisis of the old development models. These models are widely criticized as neo-colonial, and this approach certainly must be rethought in the context of the new rising economies in the country. So we have global south rising, and we have old enough developmental models which are not really, in agreement with each other. Thus, our world is in constant search of decolonizing development models for the new global south. I would kind of pinpoint this as the first important trend. And this trend is, has of course been certainly strengthened by the anti-racist movements in the US and elsewhere, and by the COVID-related and by the COVID crisis. I think that, well, we all witnessed how COVID demonstrated, among other things, appalling lack of solidarity in the old world order. So on the one hand, we have this new important player in the world order. This is global south. On the other hand, there is this lack of solidarity among global north countries. Anti-racist movements, on the other hand, showed the extent to which basic concepts of our world order, such as nation, international order, states, etc., are shaped by the past colonial experience. So now the search for the new concept of the development, we have the search for the basis of the new solidarity, for renewed political language, And this search certainly puts a question of the new international political ideal on the new world order. And the main question is, well, is it really possible now? What this kind of international political ideal should be? Are apparently new development projects, such as, for example, Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, or BRICS-related New Development Bank, are they really new? Or they're just repeating the same kind of neo-colonial models and the same old neo-colonial approaches? This is what basically I think we are going to talk about today. We have a great group of panelists, and we start today with a discussion of the different models of the development in South Asia and in China. And this talk will be given by Professor Tomasz Lukaszuk from the University of Warsaw, Poland. I beg your pardon if all panelists if I pronounce the names wrongly, but I'm trying my best. We will proceed then with the analysis of the Belt and Road Initiative and its role in development of Myanmar. And this will be talked by Ramya Panuganti from South Asian University from India. Then we proceed with the discussion of the role of ideological blocks in this new international order and post-COVID international order. This will be talked by Nujat Nazneen from Amity University, also from India. And finally, we will finish today with the U.S. election and the U.S. foreign policy, which of course continues to shape much of our international life. And this will be the talk of Dr. Monish Turanbaum from the Manipal University of Higher Education again in India. So this is our plan for today. I would encourage panelists to take up to 15 minutes, not more, to give time possibilities for the further questions and answers. Now I invite Professor Tomasz Lukaszuk from the University of Warsaw, from Poland, to give his insight on South Africa and China, on the clash of the two models of the development. So Tomasz, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much, the Institute, for organizing such a big conference in the time of pandemic, and this really the lifetime experience for every one of us. When I was in Southeast Asia in the 90s and beginning of the 21st century, the experience was already there with the first wave of pandemic. Everyone of us remember that experience with SARS and bird flu or swine flu. So it was the first experience for those countries, and the reaction was different in many countries, but certainly it wasn't spread around the world. Nowadays, we have different approaches toward pandemia, different models, and not only different models from the medical point of view, but also different models from the economic and political angle. And this is also very, very typical for the countries that they are reacting accordingly to the models of development. And if we take a look at the reaction of China, and we take the look at the reaction of South Asian countries, so we can see that the difference when we have the very state run process and controlled by state from very beginning, and the concentration in China on the interests of state, interests of the country, and the interests of the organization. And we have a look at South Asia when the approach was more humanized, was focus on particular cases, was focused on the human side and how to make the particular situation with COVID-19 more humanized, and let's say how the ways find the ways to help every person. And I think this is also the dilemma between two biggest civilizations and to all the civilizations in the world, when you have China and you have the South Asia, because this is the dilemma for South Asia, to become like China, very hard powerish, or to just or to stay as they develop for the last centuries, to be concentrated on development of every person, and to be focused on own development, not on expansion towards east or west or south. And this is also, let's say, historical comparison when you are we're discussing the expansion, or let's say the knowledge about the Indian civilization and the Chinese civilization. So always there is a discussion about Admiral Zheng He trips to other continents and around Asia many centuries ago. And when we're discussing the Indian inputs and in knowledge about India, this is very much soft power. And this is about the religion, this is about the spiritual values. And nowadays we have this Yoga Day around the world proclaimed by United Nations. So this really developmental dilemma for them. I mean, how to for South Asia, especially for India, how to adjust to the terms of the game, when we have on the one side the new, let's say, rising superpower like China, with the mentioned by Professor the Belt and Road Initiative, which is growing to become not only say Asia-wide or Europe-wide, but global-wide infrastructure program, which from my perspective is introducing new kind of hegemony after 20th century of American hegemony. Now we are getting acquainted with Chinese hegemony. And from this angle, we really can see that for South Asia, it's a big question mark how to go further, because certainly there are some liberal values, some spiritual values, and democratic values, which they are very much stick to in South Asia, and we have a very coercive and very authoritarian kind of politics in China, and as I said, the expansion of China in not only in Asia but also in Europe and Africa. And for South Asia is a question how to develop the cooperation, because certainly in the countries, the South Asian countries alone, they cannot cope by themselves alone with the issue of Chinese expansion and Chinese new kind of hegemonies. And certainly the answer is, as always, from liberal point of view, that the international organizations and the integration and the closer cooperation, this is the proper answer for the challenges coming in the 21st century. For South Asia, the Chinese model is certainly it seemed like a very practical one and very realistic in facing all the developmental challenges, especially in building infrastructure within the states and between the states. But the model which China, together with Belt and Road Initiative and many other initiatives, is trying to introduce is referring to that Admiral Zheng He model of proceeding. But during the Admiral Zheng He voyagers trips, Admiral Zheng He was insisting countries he visited to acknowledge that China is the highest authority, and China is the biggest power in Asia. Not speaking about at that time the world. And if we look at the documents of China and the plan to reestablish that Admiral Zheng He vision, reestablish by year 2049 for 100 years anniversary of the Chinese Revolution. So we see that for South Asian countries, there is a really need to get closer together and to have the joint vision of sustainable development, and also to have the model which is the model of development which is close to the particular model of the historic experience, and the particular model also of the so-called soft power. Because as normative powers, we have two different also models from China and from South Asia. But certainly we can discuss the organizations, we discuss the integration and the cooperation. But if we look at the situation right now, the situation is really difficult, because, as Professor said, so by the end of the day, every country is coping by itself with COVID-19. So how in the situation of pandemia you can develop the regional integration? The regional integration in South Asia is really, if you compare to Southeast Asia, for example, to ASEAN, is a very low level. In terms of cohesion, of development, in terms of the joint actions in human security, in not speaking about the political cooperation. With ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, since 2015, we have community. We have the Asian type of integration model. So against all odds and against all critics coming from many corners of the world, ASEAN made it. So it's possible to establish the European Union style, but with with Asian model, the cooperation and the international organization. So the answer of South Asia probably could be the organization, the remodeled organization of SAARC and BIMSTEC, adjusted to the current conditions, and with the model which is following not the European, I mean, as you put it, neocolonial, some ways neocolonial style, but the experiences and lessons learned by Southeast Asian nations. I think this will be a real challenge for them in facing China, especially with the amount of funds China is spending for a BRI project. But if we take a look at the opportunities for the cooperation and joint actions of South Asia, it could be for them possible to not, let's say, competing with the Chinese expansion, but to adjust also the kind of model of development to their own terms, and allowing them also to cooperate as a joint force, to cooperate with China. So just putting it, wrapping up, I would say that the clash in development models means this is not the perspective for a conflict. This is a different way of looking at the world and the sustainable development goals under the United Nations organization. And the South Asia can develop a different way, can take it its own way without losing in competition, especially in economics, in competition with China. But it needs joint actions, and it needs cooperation, which nowadays, as I said, is really difficult because every country has to cope by itself with COVID-19, but hopefully within 1 or 2 years, we can, all of us, not only South Asia, but all of us, we can find all the medical treatments or vaccination which will be introduced and applied to all the people, allowing us to return to normal life. And with this optimistic note, I would like to end. Thank you much.
Thank you very much. And well, you talked nicely about, you know, the difference in the interest and the difference and the clash of the possible development models between China and South Asia. And I think that our next speaker is just naturally would continue this this line of thought, because she, I mean, Ramya Panuganti, who is PhD candidate from South Asian University, India. She will talk about China's main, developmental project, which is Belt and Road Initiative, and its influence in Myanmar. So the question is, she's going to ask: is Beijing footprints are strong enough in this country? So Ramya, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chair, for those kind words, and I hope to continue the natural flow of progression and following a really excellent presentation. At the outset, a very good afternoon, evening, morning to all the attendants, and I would take this opportunity to thank NIICE and WPT for this opportunity, and Dr. Monish Sarambam for giving me this chance of presenting. I have a presentation, and I'll just share the screen for the same. One second. Is the presentation visible to everybody?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the topic of my presentation is China's BRI in Myanmar, is Beijing's footprint strong? So the underpinning assumption of my title is that China does indeed have a stronghold in Myanmar, economically, politically, and strategically. My presentation will be an attempt to unpack this assumption, to test its tenacity, and probably even change it or challenge it to a certain extent. Therefore, I will now proceed to outlining the format of my presentation, which would be giving a brief history of the bilateral relations that China and Myanmar share, China's approach to Myanmar and a framework that I have developed, an overview of what BRI entails within Myanmar, and some concluding remarks. So coming to the historical relations, I go back to the 15th century, wherein Myanmar's ethnic minorities such as the Shan and Kachin are said to have originated from China's Yunnan province. Although China and Myanmar share cultural, racial, and even linguistic affinities, even historically, Myanmar, or then Burma, remained exclusive to Manchu or Ming rule. Despite the several attempted invasions of Burma through Yunnan, Myanmar can hence not be classified as a tributary state of historical Chinese empire. Now, the reason why I bring up these historical ties is because Myanmar is often conceived as a vassal or a tributary state of China, especially when you're reading literature on ancient ties between these two countries. And what certain analysis also states is that contemporary relations between the two countries, that is modern day Myanmar's dependence on China, goes back to this historic period. However, this idea is challenged by Myanmar, of course, and its successive governments. And when I say successive governments, I mean the military government as well as the democratic government. Both challenge this notion through the historical facts that I just highlighted, some of them, that Myanmar is not a vassal state or a tributary state of China. I think that's an important point to keep in mind as I progress through this presentation. I'll now quickly fast forward to the U Nu period, who was the first Prime Minister of Myanmar, and describe that this period of relations as cautious but friendly. It was cautious because of the geostrategic position of Myanmar. In fact, a declassified document by the British Foreign Ministry stated that the Burmese overestimated the seriousness of Chinese Communist Party's threat and firmly believed in 1949 that the Chinese would not hesitate to attack Burma. U Nu's oft-quoted line that Myanmar is a tender gourd among cactus, I think describes how that relationship can be during that period. And it is still true to this day. The tender gourd is, of course, Myanmar, and the cactus refers to China and India, and Myanmar being juxtaposed between the two. Another sticking point of relations at this time was China's support to the Communist Party of Burma. However, relations started improving in 1954, and this phase was called the Pok Po phase. Pokpo essentially means fraternal brothers or cousins. And I want to discuss three important points during this period. One was that in 1954, Myanmar and China signed their first bilateral trade agreement. And in 1960, Myanmar was the first country that signed the Treaty of Cooperation and Non-Aggression with China. It was also the first country to resolve its border dispute with China. So much so that actually Beijing thought that its relationship with Myanmar should become a model for relationships of how it would build with other countries in the region, specifically Southeast Asia and even South Asia. Now, coming to the period of Ne Win, who is the dictator, military dictator and head of Myanmar, the relations during this period started out friendly, but then became sour. That's because of the excesses of the Cultural War revolution in China and their support towards the Burmese Communist Party, which eventually led to the anti-China protests in 1969. However, relations improved in 1971. What I would want to highlight during Ne Win's period is the period of 1980s. The 1980s becomes extremely important because this was the time when Chinese newspapers described relations with Myanmar as a golden bond of friendship. Of course, this was not a friendship of equals given the variation in size and power. During this period, it was observed that Myanmar extended its support to China during voting in the United Nations. This is an important point because today, if you look back, the tables have turned. Myanmar looks at China for support and its veto power to protect it and isolate it at the United Nations Security Council. What I do want to highlight is that it was the seeds of BRI that were sowed in the 1980s during the bilateral relations. And I say this because we're all aware that in the 1980s, China initiated a number of economic reform under Deng Xiaoping. And this is when China actively began engaging with its neighborhood. Specifically, the geo-economic dimension of promoting China's growth, specifically from the landlocked province of Yunnan, was a main motivating factor of China approaching Myanmar. It looked at Myanmar as a land bridge to revive its southwest Silk Route by providing the southwestern provinces an outlet to the coast and into the Indian Ocean. This thinking gained momentum in China in the mid-1980s, with the ideas of using Myanmar's railroads, for instance, from Myitkyina and Lashio as conduits for Chinese goods. The idea was espoused officially in a written article in the Beijing Review in 1985, outlining how China should use Myanmar, and I quote, as a gateway into the Indian Ocean. And hence, I reiterate, the seeds of the BRI were planted during this period in Myanmar. Now moving on to the military junta period. This period is when the relations between the two countries kind of cemented, and the stronghold support that my title assumes comes from this period. It's described as Sino-Burmese Entente, which is driven by Myanmar's military's need for international recognition and legitimacy. Now, this need for international legitimacy came because of the two crises. One was the 888 crisis, and the other was the 1990 elections in Myanmar. The 888 crisis was essentially a pro-democratic movement in which the military thwarted and killed a lot of locals and citizens. And this was when Aung San Suu Kyi kind of rose in Myanmar as a face and beacon for democracy, wherein the 1990 elections took place and her party, that is the National League for Democracy, won with an overwhelming majority. Obviously, those election results were not accepted by the military and it continued to rule. And at the same time, in 1989, the Tiananmen Square incident took place in China, and China itself was facing a lot of international scrutiny and pressure given the circumstances. And this kind of brought both the neighbors closer together. And the decade of 90s saw Myanmar's growing reliance on China economically, politically, and militarily. However, there was some amount of pushback in the 2000s. This is mentioned by my previous speaker also in terms of the ASEAN. Myanmar gained attendance into ASEAN in 1997. It became a member. And it also sought out options in other countries, such as Russia and Japan, and even India to some extent. However, India is another case because it was not engaging quite well with Myanmar at that time. But Russia and Japan were seen as good alternatives to China at that point. Now, having spelled out the history of the bilateral relations, I'll try and proceed to give a framework that I have developed of China's approach towards Myanmar. And this I call the three-level analysis. What I mean by the three-level analysis is that I look at how different actors operate between the two countries at the interstate level, at the intrastate level, and at the micro level, which forms identity politics. Now, as you will notice on the screen, that three factors, that is history, geography, and politics, they run throughout the framework. Now, history is kind of explained by the bilateral backdrop that I gave of the two countries. Geography is quite self-explanatory. However, I do define politics specifically as the manner in which the actors operate at each of these levels and the underpinning motivations for those actions. Now, at the interstate level, if you look closely, the actors are, of course, the Tatmadaw, which is Myanmar's military, the NLD government, which is the current elected government of Myanmar, headed by Aung San Suu Kyi, the state councillor, the CPC, and the PLA of China. At the intrastate level, two additional actors enter the fold, and this is when things become interesting. One is the ethnic armed groups within Myanmar who are located at the peripheries, and the other is the Yunnan provincial government. What I would like to highlight is the dual approach policy of China that is observed at this stage. The dual approach policy of China, I mean, is that its interaction at the interstate level and the intrastate level vary. And this is because what Beijing pursues as a policy is sometimes in contradiction to what Yunnan province pursues as a policy. This is specifically seen in the case of how the provincial government vis-a-vis the central government of China have approached the peace process in Myanmar, or even in terms of how resources are shared, like timber, jade, etc. And it's become a major sticking point amongst the locals in Myanmar who have gained mistrust towards China in this regard. Because they say that the Yunnan provincial government provides arms and equipment to the militia, while the Beijing government backs the Tatmadaw. And this dual approach has contradicted a lot of policies and wherewithal of how China interacts with the Southeast Asian country. And it also goes on to interfere at the micro level. Here you see that what I mean by center-periphery dynamics is actually the foundational conundrum that is Myanmar. The center is dominated by the Bamar ethnic, which is Buddhist dominant. And you have the peripheries that have a lot of minority ethnics, such as the Shans, the Kachins, the Shins, etc. And Myanmar is home to one of the world's longest civil war. And within this influx, you have the Chinese diaspora, like I highlighted in the historical relations, who have existed from a long time. But now there's a new change that is occurring, and that is the entry of Chinese entrepreneurs. This entry happened in the 1990s when Myanmar began depending on China. And the mistrust also became there because the Beijing followed one, and the dual approach of Yunnan created further problems. Now, keeping this three-level analysis in mind, I'll move on to explaining what the BRI entails within Myanmar. So Myanmar joined the BRI in 2017. It's part of two economic corridors, that is the Bangladesh-China, India-Myanmar economic corridor and the China-Indochina Peninsula economic corridor. And this is by virtue of Myanmar's geography, which is in between Southeast Asia and South Asia. I do want to draw people's attention to the CMEC, which is the China-Myanmar economic corridor. And I want to highlight the timing of when the CMEC was introduced. So basically, what I mean by timing is when Myanmar was facing tough international criticism owing to the Rohingya crisis in the Rakhine state, it was seen as moving away from Beijing and looking out for other options. But given this international scrutiny that was highlighted on Myanmar, that's when CMEC was introduced by Beijing to Myanmar. And this is important because at this stage, Myanmar was not headed by the military junta. It was headed by Aung San Suu Kyi, which was a democratically elected government. And given the circumstances of the time, Myanmar, of course, agreed to the proposal and signed on to CMEC. The three important projects within CMEC that need to be noted. One is linking Yunnan province to Mandalay region within Myanmar. The second is the Yangon New City project, and the third is the Chokpu Special Economic Zone. Now, I want to highlight that the Yangon New City project was seen as a very big project within the BRI. But what eventually happened is that a lot of public criticism came its way, and the Chinese tenders that were put in place were questioned. And Japan saw its power rising, and it tried to contribute to the Yangon New City project. And this is still a developing aspect, so I won't go into details about it. But I do want to highlight two important projects within the BRI in Myanmar that were suspended. One is the Midzone dam, and the second is the Lepidong copper mine. I'm sure a lot of you must have heard about Mitsun, but if you haven't, I'll just give a brief backdrop. It's located in the Kachin state, which is at the periphery of Myanmar, and it was severely criticized for the environmental hazards that it would have on the river systems and the waterways of Myanmar. And this is seen as a massive mega water project where most of the electricity that was generated would go to Yunnan province and not the locals. So it was highly contested at the local level as well. And importantly, the Mitsun Dam was the first time that it became the anti-China sentiment became kind of a flashpoint in the bilateral relations. And I say this because it was not just the periphery ethnics who were protesting against the use of their resources for China's benefit, but it was also the central Burmars who joined in that protest. So you saw a national level uprising almost against this project, which was not seen before. And it led to the suspension of the project in 2011. And most significant to note is that in 2011, the government at the center in Myanmar was headed by the military general Thein Sein, and he suspended that project. This project still remains in limbo as we speak, and a lot of controversy surrounds it. The second is the Lepidong copper mine project. This project was suspended in 2013. This project is also located in the Sagaing region, which is another region in the periphery of Myanmar, and in Moniva. This project, interestingly, was reinitiated again in 2016. And if you go through cursory reports, the human rights abuses of the Chinese, of the local laborers continues. So much so that I think 6 months back, Aung San Suu Kyi headed a committee to look at the problems that the locals were facing at Lepidong, because a lot of cases were filed against the Chinese workers there for their inhuman treatment of laborers, local laborers. But nothing seems to have moved forward, and the project is continuing as it was, although it was suspended for 3 brief years. The reason why I brought out these 2 projects is to show the contrast in how China's lobbying power operates within the country. At one level, it is of course very strong, as you saw that the Lepidong project, after being suspended, restarted again, even with the democratically elected government back in power. But you have the Mitsun that remains a sticking point. And I think this binary in which how Myanmar is approaching China is reflective of the overall policy of how Myanmar is looking at BRI as well. And one of the other aspects of the mistrust that I spoke about is Myanmar's national debt. Myanmar has a national debt of about 10 billion, 40% of which is owed to China. So this is always a sticking point in every discussion of economic projects that China and Myanmar engage in. Now I want to go into a little analytical aspects of why the BRI is perhaps not moving forward as it is conceived than in the 1990s. For instance, what I mean is, if the BRI was proposed in the 1990s, the projects would have progressed much faster than they are now. And the reasons I will outline as follows. The slow progress has been mainly because of the transitioning process of Myanmar from authoritarian state towards disciplined democracy is what they call it. And after this, I'll give you some facts to just understand what I mean. After the initial proposal was made in November 2017, a memorandum of understanding for the CMEC was signed. In 2018, Aung San Suu Kyi even set up a steering committee, and she herself headed it to ensure that these projects would move forward smoothly, but that has not been the case. In fact, last year when Aung San Suu Kyi went to Beijing in April, it was said that she was given 30 proposals by China to be made as part of CMEC, but only 9 were approved. That created a lot of stir within Myanmar as well. So just for comparison, when I say slow, how am I making that assumption? I'll give you a comparison with how the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor progressed in relation to CMEC. So the CPEC, as soon as it was announced, the Chinese FDI in Pakistan had increased up to 240%. And it's been reported that 17 CPEC projects have brought in tax revenues worth 930 million in Pakistan. The implementation has not been smooth in Pakistan as well. I will not make such a generalization, but Imran Khan, when he did come to the helm of affairs, said that the CPEC projects would be his top priority. In contrast, Myanmar's investment picture show a very different story. in 2017 and 18, the fiscal year, the CMEC was proposed. When CMEC was proposed, the approved investment from China was to be 1.395 billion. However, in the next 1 year, it fell to just 600 million. And the numbers would suggest that although China and Chinese companies are investing in Myanmar, the investment strategy has been geared towards smaller projects instead of mega infrastructure projects with which BRI is usually associated with. And I think this is a major distinguishing factor of Myanmar from other BRI recipient countries across the world. There could be more major infrastructure projects that would be announced publicly. They may come, but for the most part, they're not here yet, which is why I believe that it's been a slow progress. Another reason for the slow progress is also the internal conflicts that plague Myanmar. Like I said, there is a lot of armed conflict that is ongoing in Myanmar. But my question is this: it never stopped China from investing in Myanmar when there was conflict earlier. So what has changed now? So at the cost of conjecture, I propose it has a lot to do with the institutional changes that Myanmar is seeing. And these changes are forcing the government to pay heed to the antipathy towards China at the local level. However, at the same time, I would be naive enough to think that China's influence is contested by any other country in Myanmar, and it still remains a strong lobby. So in conclusion, I would like to throw light on China's COVID aid diplomacy. Throughout the world, it's been pushing a lot of COVID aid diplomacy, and Myanmar has been no different. But one sticking point is that Myanmar understood that the lot of aid that was coming in came with certain baggage and certain prices attached to it. For instance, in May this year, Xi Jinping called up Daung San Suu Kyi, and media reports suggest that during the phone call, he urged Myanmar to accelerate the BRI projects. And when he visited Myanmar in January this year, a lot of expectations were there that the BRI would get a further push and more projects would be signed, but that has not been the case. So in conclusion, I would like to say that the dual policy of China that I highlighted, the dual policy, I mean many a times Beijing's policies and interests are contrary to the policies pursued by the Yunnan provincial government. This is especially reflected in the border smuggling or the aid given to local militia. And this dual policy has eroded the trust of Myanmar's military as well, not just at the local level, but fighting the rebels, and in some ways reflective of the slow progress in the BRI projects. Hence, I see this dual policy as eroding the traditional institutional trust that is shared at the bilateral level, at the interstate level that I mean. There's also a generational unease with China. With the military and politicians, I feel the older generations where although they have some uneasiness with China, like I highlighted with UNO's statement, but there was more cooperative environment towards China, despite that uneasiness. However, the younger generation appears to be more open in showing their displeasure. But how far this will reflect in the policy, of course, is a big question. But I think it is important to note that such a sentiment exists. Ultimately, to put it in IR theory terms, I think Myanmar is advocating a hedging strategy interspersed with bargaining when dealing with China. And that goes for BRI projects as well. So, thank you.
Right, thank you very much. Well, you nicely described, the ambiguous character of, relations between Myanmar and China, and especially this, new ambitious global initiative of China, which is Bricks and Road Initiative, and it's, well, we can see how full of events and full of different approaches, the history of these relations is. Thank you very much. And our next speaker will talk about reviving ideological blocks and their role in the paradigm shift in power definition. So we go from, kind of case study, the study about or talk about two countries to rather kind of global level, the level of the power definitions, the level of the of the shift in paradigm. So, but we basically are talking more or less, all of us, we are talking more or less about the same from different angle. So the speaker is the guest faculty in Amity University in India. Her name is Dr. Nujat Nazneen, and Dr. Nazneen, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Khomyakov. Hello, everyone. So the title of my presentation, as Sir has already introduced, it's Paradigm Shift in Power Definition, Role of Reviving Ideological Blocks. So international politics is always in the face of evolution, but presently this international politics is in a phase of continuous evolution and fluctuating political calculations. After the disintegration of the USSR, the balance of power was skewed towards the US. However, in the absence of one power commanding authority today, regularly changing politically induced power equations place us in a situation to be unsure who the great power is and who is the one challenging it. The paper attempts to inquire about the meaning and location of great power today. Political Islam ideologically challenges Western hegemony, but there is no effective Muslim bloc to induce that challenge. However, China, with its growing relationship with Pakistan, is playing a significant role either in giving birth to a new Muslim bloc or to provide assistance in stabilizing the existing one. With recent developments between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan and their political brouhaha, it seems that there awaits a shift in power in the Middle East, and with it lies a chance for the proliferation of Chinese domination with the support of the reviving Muslim lobby, primarily comprising of Turkey, Malaysia, and Pakistan. In this analysis, Iran, with its political influence, provides an interesting angle because on one hand, it is enjoying the place of the kingmaker, and on the other hand, is also a weak link of both the rivals, Israel's supported US and China backing a Muslim bloc. Ideological arrangements of the day. See, geostrategic history of the modern world bears witness to the ideological clash between the capitalist US and communist Russia, which is continuing the legacy of the erstwhile USSR. However, now the hegemonic and imperialistic power of the US is being challenged by another aggressive expansionist state, China. The weakening position of the US in its global leadership under the Trump administration, coinciding with the Chinese economic and diplomatic augmentation in its region and beyond, leaves open the political battlefield to claim world leadership. Europe has reached the stabilizing heights of their political statements on various issues, hence are strengthening their status quo. Asia and Middle East are emerging as active regions which are to play a role in defining power politics. This shift in the base of power struggle is expected to impact also the definition of power. China envisages world leadership via its regional supremacy in the Asia Pacific. The humongous takeover of China of the region through Belt Road Initiative, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, airport construction tender in Sylhet, Bangladesh, or Pokhara, Nepal, and assisting landlocked Nepalese trade economy with an alternative pathway as an alternative to the existing Indian routes. This takeover is a structural move to reinforcing its ties with the nations with economic instabilities. It is unjust not to talk on Russian equation while discussing the future course of international politics. Communist ideology provides additional support to keep the two giants, Russia and China, together. Their common dismissal of the US-led world order leads to their strategic partnership in growing energy trade, weapon sales of Russia to China, and diplomatic cooperation over some levels of their common concerns in the Middle East, despite their simultaneous disagreements over energy, weapon sales, and the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014. Moreover, the regional sanction to its political supremacy is showing no sign of putting China at halt. And here comes the role of reviving ideological bloc endorsing Muslim unity. American interests in the Middle East have successfully kept the Muslim alliances under control via the upper current of the bilateral ties between the US and Saudi Arabia. Subsequently, Imran Khan, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Mahathir bin Mohammed, a statesman and ex-Prime Minister of Malaysia, and Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the President of Turkey, have been contemplating to establish a Muslim organization to provide an alternative narrative to pro-American Saudi Arabian leadership in the Organization of Islamic Countries. This posse finds in China a legitimate ally who is equally critical of the Western ideological control. Through this alliance, China seeks to penetrate into the politically shattered and economically devastated but strategically crucial region of West Asia and Middle East. Iranian foreign policy has been a difficult puzzle to crack as far as its political inclinations are considered. It has offered potential partnerships to both the US and China, and India and Pakistan. However, recently after the US imposed sanctions on Iran, with no other option but to revive its 2016 deal with China, despite its fear of compromising sovereignty in return for economic stability. The US, in its political stubbornness and for the equation with Saudi Arabia, failed to exploit Iran as a viable tool to enhance an American influence in the region. US sanctions against Iran and its simultaneous move to China simultaneous move of Iran to China has impacted Indo-Iranian relationship as well, which is expected to grow bleaker under intensifying Chinese influence on Iran. These changes in the geopolitical circumstances improve the chance of Iran joining the yet-to-develop Muslim assemblage. Moreover, the decision of the US to vacate Afghanistan after the combined peace efforts between US-Pakistan on one hand and Taliban on the other puts India, the present-day US ally in the region, in a vulnerable position. Under these circumstances, Washington needs to formulate foreign policies considering the complex matrix in the Asia-Pacific, where backtracking of the US seems inevitable. On the concluding note, I would like to say that in this discourse on great power rivalry, China and US emerge as the key arch rivals contending global supremacy. However, post-pandemic economic dealings and diplomatic strategies of China through its mask diplomacy and soft power engagement, it has gained an upper hand in the equation. Political calculations indicate that in the near future, the US is to face intensified difficulties in maintaining the leading role, and influence of China is expected to spread across Europe. Nonetheless, in faraway future, ideological differences between China and the emerging or reviving Muslim bloc might start to create problems. Also, Russia is compromising with Chinese increasing influence at the cost of its overshadowing regional status because their contemporary politics is against a common enemy, the US. What future holds for these two countries once this common enemy is neutralized is unsure. Despite all these uncertainties, political analysts are not to ignore the fact that Chinese growing hegemony is primarily through economic ties, where its own stakes are high. Therefore, these stakes are expected to translate into ideological equilibrium to be reached through mutual tolerance and politics of silence and indifference in the conflicting matters. However, in this growing regional shrink, India provides an interesting perspective when it continues with its committed ties with the capitalist US. On one hand, despite the available precedents where the US has always weighed its national interests even at the cost of its allies, India, while trusting the assurances from the US, is risking its regional acceptance and economic benefits by not exploring the opportunities of economic connectivity with China. On the other hand, China is neglecting the significance of India, risking regional peace and security. As per the undertaken discussion, multiple power centers with their organizational alliances are to lead in international politics. The future is expected not to be the winning story of a state, but of that state that is leading and is smoothing the workings throughout distinctive blocks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And well, it's a very important angle of analysis. I mean, not only from the point of economical interests or political interests of particular nations, but also from the point of view of ideology and soft power, and I think it does add to our discussion very nice, kind of touch and very, very fine nuance, I would say. This talk brings us closer to the US, since one of the clashing interests here was the US foreign policy, which nicely brings about our next speaker, who is the senior assistant professor in Manipal University of Academy of Higher Education in India and visiting fellow in NIICE, who in Nepal, who will talk about COVID-19, U.S. election, and what lies ahead for the U.S. foreign policy. So, Dr. Monish Turangbam, the floor is yours. No? You're mute. Hello, Dr. Turangam?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Spasibo. Thank you, Professor Khomyakov. I will put on my military stopwatch so that I don't stretch beyond time. Yes, I've been talking about COVID-19, US election, and what lies ahead for US foreign policy. Try to sort of find the interlocking sort of, connections in all of them. And I'll stick to 5 propositions. The first one is that there is a U.S. foreign policy, and there is an election time U.S. foreign policy. I tried to sort of demarcate both of these 2 things, that you get to hear a different kind of U.S. foreign policy during the campaign season and during the election. The second thing is that the pandemic, the COVID-19, and all of that, the U.S. Establishment is going through, and the socio-political dynamics in U.S. is going through, has sort of amplified, this dichotomy between what is the general trend of U.S. foreign policy and what is U.S. foreign policy during election time. The third proposition is that is there a democratic U.S. foreign policy, and is there a GOP or a Republican foreign policy? Is there a difference between the 2? And of course, the last proposition would be that as the Republican convention talk about making America great again, and the Democratic convention talk about redeeming the soul of America, what lies ahead for the future of alliances and partnerships and the future of multilateralism and bilateralism in US foreign policy. So I'll stick to these 4 propositions. Coming to the first one, and I think it's the right time to talk about, because we have just the 2 conventions sort of concluded, and the presumptive nominees became technically the nominees for the presidential candidates and the vice presidential candidates. And what you see during election campaign, and what you will see from now on, is that both the parties are going to scare the hell out of American voters. And I say this, the element of fear in US election campaign. If you see both the parties, the Democratic Party is going to tell American voters, hey, don't go for this guy again. If he comes back to the White House for next 4 years, America is doomed, right? So we're gonna change this guy, and it's now a call for now or never. That, it's, as Hillary herself said, this is not going to be like a could be, would be election, but it's a time for everyone to sort of come out and then vote against Trump. So on the other hand, you will see that the Republican Party again is going to tell that if this Biden team and this Democratic Party comes to power, it's going to bring, and these words, I was counting the number of times I heard the word socialist in the convention, and they were, you're going to hear the Republican Party saying that if the Biden teams comes to power in the White House, they're going to bring socialism in America. Now, what is that socialism? We can debate till the cow comes home. So so this fear and US election is a very let's say it's a very centrality in US election, and in and foreign policy occupies a different kind of magnanimity during the election campaign. During the Reagan period, you had the great bear sort of roaming around, and they even had a political ad campaign where the great bear was roaming around, and we know who was the great bear, and I don't need to tell Professor Maxim who was the great bear. And when in the post 9/11 period, you had a political campaign where they said wolves are lurking in the woods, and we know who are the wolves. They were the global terrorists. So this time again, you're going to have your usual, like the China fear, the Russia affair to some extent, and how each of these parties are going to sort of amplify that they that either GOP is the party which is going to save the Americans from these threats, or either Trump and 4 more years of Trump is the one that is going to sort of save America from these threats. So you do have the broader trends of US foreign policy, which basically does not change much no matter who comes to the White House, because you have what they call as the deep state in Washington, or the beltway politics in Washington. And despite Trump saying that businessmen came to overhaul all of that and pull down all of that structure in US foreign policy making, I think the reality is a little more complex than what he would have you believe. So COVID-19 certainly has amplified that element, in the sense that you have a more, let's say, you have a more amplified China affair, the China virus being named, and the whole debate about even the naming of the virus. And both the parties sort of saying, specifically from the Republican Party, and there's a whole lot of debate in the US, Washington, that who allowed China to grow like this, who accommodated China and trying to bring it into the WTO, and signing a lot of stuffs and allowing China to grow to be the behemoth and the dragon that it has become. And then so like in olden times, you had this debate about who lost China or who lost Iran. You are having a similar kind of debate about who allowed China to grow like this. So the Republican Party is going to tell that it's the Dems who allowed China to grow like this, and then it's only the GOP, and specifically Trump's GOP, and it's a big debate now, that is Trump's Republican Party really similar to the Republican Party that we really have assumed, in the sense that you must have seen that none of the Republican former presidents came up to speak in the Republican convention. So you see this sort of churning within the GOP itself. So you are going to have a lot of China threat during the election campaign, and there might be a little bit of difference in tonality and cadence and force when both the parties speak, and the kind of allegations and accusations that both the parties are going to make on each other, in terms of who allowed China to grow, and who tried to, if I could draw an analogy of trying to train the dragon, who tried to domesticate the dragon and who failed in the process, right? So could you domesticate the dragon? And the answer in some cases is no, you can't domesticate the dragon, because the dragon will be a dragon and it will never be a democratic country, never join the liberal international order in the way you wanted it to be, right? So there is a huge debate about that in the United States. And the question as we go ahead is going to be, now, which is the party, which is the leader who is going to be able to tame this dragon, and deal with China and show China its place, all those kind of debates. So I think on the other hand, you're going to have to deal with this another side of the debate, which is about who is taming American power. Do we need to tame American power? Do we need to sort of like recalibrate US foreign policy of not going to wars and getting into an overstretch of American resources? How does that sort of align with America First policy, and what does that really mean about the future of US force projection and power projection from the Western Pacific to the Atlantic, and to the Middle East and other places? So next, I would come to my third proposition. Is there when you look at both the parties, one of the terms that is often used in America is that the difference between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party has been that of a Tweedledee and Tweedledum. So, the point is, do you really see a difference? Because there's a broader trend of US foreign policy. And, after every election, what we have seen in USA is this revolving door of advisors of foreign policy that goes and comes. So when the Republican Party wins the election, the revolving door takes out a lot of people. They go back to the think tanks and research firms. When the Democratic Party wins the election, the same guys will come back from the think tank, and then through the revolving door, they will enter the policy-making circle. There has been a little bit of a churning on that during the Trump administration, in the sense that the number of political appointees, filling up the middle rank of the State Department hierarchy, apart from the permanent bureaucracy, there has been a little bit of a change in that, in terms of being late in appointing some of them, not appointing some of them. So I think there has been a little bit of a churning during the Trump administration and US foreign policy, but overall, the threat perceptions of the United States, from Russia or from the People's Republic of China, and from other middle-rung threats like Iran, which are not really a threat to American hegemony, but nevertheless, they can create problems for America as far as maintaining regional order for America is concerned in a lot of places. So the threats, to my mind, the threats are not going to undergo a dramatic change, no matter who comes to the White House, even in the event of a Joe Biden and Kamala Harris sort of coming into the White House, winning the election. I don't see much of a change in the approach, to China that has developed in this last 4 or 5 years. As I said, there might be a difference in how you speak about it. There might be a difference in how you pass the message. But I don't think there will be a dramatic change in terms of looking at threat perceptions, because these are more institutionally bound perceptions which are built in an interagency process of US policy making, and not necessarily dramatically affected by a Trump or a Biden sort of coming to the election. So I think there will be much more continuity in terms of America's alignment of its aspirations and capabilities of thinking how to do more with less, if you are looking at the resources that are available to America, and the dent that has been made in American primacy in a number of places in a relative sense when you look at the rise of other powers. So those are the kind of concerns which are going to animate American foreign policy, despite the change or the continuity of what the election is going to bring ahead. If you look at the one proposition that has been put forward a lot is that Trump is against multilateralism, and all of that is there in the sense of the things that you get to hear from the Democratic Party also, that whatever he has done has been against the strength of the alliances and partnerships that the Americans have built over the years. But if I see the undercurrent of all of this, again, I would say that Trump, negotiating with the NATO partners for burden sharing and others, I don't really see that as a Trump era problem. This predates Trump. Even during the Obama administration, there were a lot of negotiations about NATO burden sharing, but the difference is that Obama did not speak about it the way Trump spoke about it. Obama did not line up, other G7 members and told them on their face that you need to do more. So I think the way it is being done is much more different, which comes from the personality of Trump. And if Trump comes back to power, we might see a continuity of that, and a little bit of a difference in how America renegotiates the terms of engagement with its alliances and partnerships, and also the terms of engagement as far as multilateral institutions are concerned, and how America puts across its role in multilateral institutions. But because let's remember that hegemony is intricately tied with multilateralism. The only way Americans see it in a post-1945 security and financial order of preserving its hegemony is by spearheading multilateral institutions. So you have a love and hate relationship with multilateralism when you become a hegemon. So I think in my final analysis, I think even as the political polarization grows in USA, and you will see a much more dirty campaign politics in the months to come, given the fact that people will be more afraid to come out and vote, and the postal service in US is going to assume much more importance for mail-in voting in America. And now that you have the presidential debates and the vice presidential debate coming up, you will see much more mudslinging from both the sides, and much more scaring of the American voters that unless you vote for this guy, your life is going to be in trouble. So the scare tactic is going to be there. It will increase, but I see that the broader trends of American foreign policy perhaps will not see a dramatic shift even in the course of the election. And that's my summation. Again, thank you very much for the time, and I'll be ready to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Turangbam. We actually ran out of the list of the speakers. Everybody, so we had, I think, just great, range of the talks, from clash of models of the development up to the, a rich analysis of the US election and what's going to be the US foreign policy after that. So this range of talks, give lots of stuff for thinking, I would say. Now, I don't see any questions. You are supposed, everybody who do have a question is supposed to write it down in the chat. So please go to the chat and write a question to the speakers if you feel like that. In the meantime, I will probably start asking my questions, because I do have hundreds of them to each speaker. But I will start with just one question to each of you, if you don't mind. So, to Ambassador Lukashuk, well, you probably, obviously have very rich experience of South Asia, being there for quite a long time. So, what you think would be characteristic features of the new South Asian concept of the development, or model of the development, as against the model of the development promoted by China, or the model of the development which European or countries or the US, have been promoting, for quite a long time. So, what would be this kind of new features? Thank you.
Yep. Thank you very much, Professor. Yes, if you go to Bhutan and you will meet the minister in charge of happiness, you could learn that there's nothing about happiness. This is about finding the way for Bhutan to survive. First of all, to survive, to be, in between two major, to be superpowers of the world, and how to develop in a more and the best sustainable way for them to make people happy. So for Bhutanese officials, for Bhutanese government, is less about the country as itself approach, but this is about the people, the inclusiveness of all the politics. I'm speaking about the strategy of economic development. I'm speaking about social development, education, and that's why they put it in this way. So in China, you will not have a Minister of Happiness, but in Bhutan you have. So and this is the way how the people in South Asia think about the development. So how to adjust the model of development to the expectation of people, and how to make those people comfortable in that development, to make the model of development coherent, and to make it inclusive, and this is the major challenge, because this is not for Bhutanese people, as I'm just putting, and the people. This is not about how rich you will be, but this is more about spiritual richness, and this is about also meeting the traditional values. And this is also about the development of not only your own self, but your family as well. So this is how it's the different. I'm not speaking about economics and this East Asian developmental model, because this is the matter of the 20th century and the Washington Consensus. Because now, as you know, the people are more speaking about Beijing Consensus. And when I'm asking my students, so could you imagine that according to World Bank status is that if the biggest economy of the world, China, is to come, so the capital city of the world economy will move to Beijing. And certainly for today they are laughing, because they are thinking that I'm joking. But for my colleagues, professors, it's not a joke. There's a matter of China as a new normative power of the 21st century. And for the European Union, which Poland is a member of, it's a challenge, because in academia, there was always a talk about the European Union as a normative power, as a soft power, the civilian state power. And now we have China with the model which is coming with the Belt and Road Initiative, because the Belt and Road Initiative is not only about infrastructure, this is also about norms and the new model of development. So how to cope with it? I mean, you can accept the funds from BRI, but you still would like to keep your own model of development, your own values, and you don't want to become semi-authoritarian state. So this is a very big dilemma for all those countries. But as I said, in between South Asia and China, it's still the same civilizational difference between focusing on interests of country as it's and the biggest group, because you are not important, because you are only the part of organization. This is the Chinese model, and you have here the model of South Asia, when the person, yes, every citizen is important, and you would like to make him or her happy.
Thank you very much. How interesting, actually. And this this does provide a new insight for the development. Surely, this kind of spirituality, in the concept of the development, and hence, I would also ask Ms. Panuganti question on. You describe this ambiguity, in the relations between Myanmar and China. On the one hand, this is investment. On the other hand, there are also some tensions, some clashes. So do you also, where do you think this current politics of Myanmar is kind of oriented to? Is it more like China model of the development, or you can also see what Ambassador Lukashuk just mentioned? You also see this kind of spiritual element of the development, and is it closer to kind of other ASEAN community, or it's more like still buying the new development which is promoted by China? What would be your brief kind of
Thank you for your question. I think it's really interesting. And I'd start off by saying that I don't think China's development towards Myanmar or its wanting to fund Myanmar is new by any sort of the imagination, because Myanmar has always kind of relied on China, and not for its own reasons, but because of the sanctions that were imposed on it by the West for a large part of its history, given the running of the military junta. And that kind of pushed the Tamado, I mean the Myanmar's military, towards China. And over time, it has, including within the military, there has been a kind of understanding that the reliance on China is overbearing, as with any state. And that discomfort that I tried to express in my presentation was essentially this, that you take economic aid, you take all of this, but the normative power, China never sought to export that until in the last decade. And I think that point needs to be understood quite carefully, because up until, like, let's say 2050, early 2000s, when Myanmar was accepting aid and all of that, not just in, look at the case of Cambodia, for instance, or you could even look at, Cambodia also, that the aid was coming, but I don't think the normative angle was that strong, because the underpinning strategy of China then was different. That shift is highly associated with the coming of the BRI. And with the coming of the BRI, specifically in the case of Myanmar, from my understanding of the situation, is that there is an internal churning of normative values in Myanmar currently. You have the military that says we need to follow a disciplined democracy. And what they mean by that is continued representation of the military in their parliament. About 25% of their seats in parliament are reserved for military, unquestioned. And the democratic government is trying to challenge that, is trying to amend the constitution. And that's an uphill battle in itself. Now, what is the role of China in this? It sees more benefit in the status quo in Myanmar and not in a change of normative order. And this, I think, is a very important marker for how China has been dealing in ASEAN as well, and creating blocks within ASEAN. For instance, I think last week, the Singapore and Indonesian ministers of development and economy stated that they do not have to choose between China or a US. That is, the ASEAN does not have to choose between either of these countries, because they have enough markets of their own, and ASEAN as a grouping has enough leverage to pull. However, in the same week, you had a Cambodia and a muted statement coming in from Myanmar that they have always sided with Beijing, and even passed a statement in this regard. So you see the staring of consensus building, which is being ASEAN's approach. And that paints a bigger picture of how China has been dealing with Southeast Asian countries. And I think Myanmar is a very good marking for this, because it's not new in Myanmar. It's been there for a long time. And the challenges Myanmar is trying to balance between, let's say, China versus India, for instance, is representative to a large degree of how Southeast Asia is also looking at China. And yeah, that's my submission. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, interestingly, you mentioned sanctions as you know, what pushed you know, Myanmar closer to China, and we can see it today as well. I mean, Iran is pushed closer to China with sanctions. Russia is certainly pushed closer to China, even if these countries might have some, especially Russia, might have some tensions and problems with China. They are also pushed closer, you know, because of the current tensions with, well, what you can call global north or collective West. Hence, well, my question is also to Dr. Nazneen, sorry, that, you know, if this is so, if sanctions are important, then, you know, what plays kind of main role is, seems to be interests and, you know, kind of economic power, and, you know, what is the real role of real ideology in that? Is it about normative kind of different normative understanding of the world order, or is it more about clash of the interests of you know, of geopolitical you know, interests and tensions, etc.? So how would you comment on that?
Thank you, Professor Khomyakov, for your very interesting question. And yeah, very relevant as well. Where we place this ideological notion, especially when we are talking about economic ties. So whenever we are talking about countries, international politics, we have the saying in IR that there are no permanent enemies and there are no permanent friends in international relations. What always remain permanent is our national interest. So equations, there are chances that equations might keep on changing, but now we have to look at the practical angle to it. That is why in my presentation as well, I have mentioned that even though there might be some clashes in future with you know, different sorts of ideological blocks, which are not there on paper, but they are there. So in future, there might be some problems or clashes, whatever it may be. But now when China is investing in economically, so the ties definitely have economic angles. But when someone's economy is at stake, what happens is that they cannot pull out of that equation suddenly. So, and whenever we are having this, we are making these blocks, even though looking from the perspective of China, this regional integration, I wouldn't call it like a regional integration, but China is having, as per my analysis, is moving in two layers. I mean, first of all, it wants to establish its hegemony, you call it hegemony, or its dominance in the regional sphere. And through that regional sphere, it wants to move to the international forum. Now, when I talk about ideological blocks, as we all know that most of the Muslim majority countries, because of their equations with Israel and other situations, even the things are changing with recently when UAE had this chat with Israel and their recent development, keeping that aside, otherwise also, there are so many Muslim blocks, the Muslim majority countries who have this anguish, they are away from pro-Western ideological development. And even when we read Huntington's Clash of Civilization, this kind of notion comes up. So ideology, and that is why, again, once towards the concluding note of my paper, I have said that it is the politics of silence, it is sometimes the politics of denial, and also sometimes the politics of indifference towards conflicting interests, that these ideological blocks, which might not be on paper, but they are existing, they will try to cope up with each other, and the state which is able to do that, that will be the leading power. And as one of the presenters also mentioned, that this is the multilateral, we are moving towards the notion of multilateralism, and we cannot deny this fact. So ideologies will be there, economic ties are guiding those ideologies, and in a way they are also guided by these ideological blocks are also guided by economic ties, as I have said also in the paper about Iran issue angle, that it went to China, compromising its sovereignty only because of the economic sanctions. But where does its ideology lie? Sometimes these political equations, other times it is the ideological notions. And then again, the other thing is that change in governments, change in the leadership, all these impact our international politics. So any day can bring any new equation, but when we have these economic stakes, then it is difficult to have this U-turn in the entire scenario, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Well, I just kind of recall Jürgen Habermas saying it, immediately after the start of Iraq war, that normative power of the US is really dead, So this was the start, according to Habermas, of the transition to, kind of multipolarity, or this was the death of the US monopoly, normative monopoly in the world. And Dr. Turangam demonstrated nicely how in the current elections, the notion of threat, the politics of fear, played or it's going to play an important part, and these are going to be the elections of fear, and not the elections, in a way, the elections of hope. And it's interesting because the last elections were poisoned by the idea of Russian hackers, influencing the US elections. So this was more Russia threat, and now it's China threat. So, well, Dr. Turangam, do you think,
So, if I can add a little more, just a little, if you permit me.
Yeah.
So, because perhaps I missed that particular angle of the question when you asked about normative order. So when we are talking about normative, order, and what is the particular normative argument of a country, if we are to look into American normative order, which is all about democracy, but then if we look in practical issues, they have ties with monarchies. I mean, even in Saudi Arabia. So what normative order are we basically talking about? On one hand, we are questioning the quote unquote normative order of the other bloc, and at the same time we're doing something similar. So at the end of the day, it's just the national interests which runs supreme, and we are at the end of the day, we are like the sellers. We are just selling our ideology so that our hegemony has to spread across globe.
Right.
So that was about this normative order, perhaps.
Yeah, right. So
thank you so much, and sorry for interrupting.
No. Thank you very much for kind of additional clarifications. So I just would like to ask Dr. Turangam, do you think these kind of fear politics and these kind of threat elections, not hope elections, they actually demonstrate the disorientation of American foreign policy in this normative sense, so that the US does not know anymore what to bring to this world. That's why they are playing fear, and they are playing threats. What do you think about that?
Okay. Thank you, Professor Khomyakov. Fantastic question. While I parroted the idea of elections and fear for dramatic effect. I will cushion that a little bit and try to put across this point of view that while there is a sense of like telling the American voters every now and then that this is what is going to happen if you don't vote or if you vote for the other guy. I think it goes hand in hand with with hope as well, right? It is not. I would just say that these are two sides of the same coin, and this is not new. Although the viciousness of the attacks against each other might have touched a new high, maybe because of the kind of personalities who come as nominees of the parties. Also, as I said, the parties are themselves undergoing a different kind of churning. There's a political polarization, what they call as the missing middle in America. And that has a larger explanation behind it in terms of why, you have a sense of the conservatives thinking that the liberals are going on the extreme left, and why the liberals think that the conservatives are going on the extreme right. So you have lesser and lesser number of people in American politics, specifically in the US Congress, who could cross the aisle from both the sides. Someone like John McCain, for example, who unfortunately, is no more. But if you look at personalities like him from the Republican Party, he was someone who could strike deals on both sides of the party. So you have lesser number of American politicians at this point of time who could do that. And I think that has to do with some of the, let's say the lack of the middle ground in what you see in elections, and then leading to this high pitch sort of focusing on the threats, which has always been a part, as I mentioned about political ads during the Cold War as well, where threats coming from the Soviet Union was very much a part of US election campaign. Like now China is. 2016, you mentioned, interesting. I had the opportunity of being in US when Trump was elected. And again, I had the opportunity of being in Russia in 2018 was when Putin got elected. So, so a lot of my friends, when I put up my visit to Russia as an election observer in Moscow and in Veliki Novgorod, most of my American friends would put comments on the Facebook like, enjoy your time. You're not going to see what you saw in America over there, right? So, I don't want to go into the details of what that really meant, but I feel that there is a certain crisis of, let's say, not really a lack of an understanding of normative notion of American power, because coming to what you are saying about Hamas, I think there has been multiple times in US history when American normative power has gone down the nadir, and and that happened during Vietnam War, that happened even during longer civil rights, for example, so race relations. I think all of that has come to a point. You have not only have the remnants of the post-Iraq America and 18 years of long war in Afghanistan, but you also have a very, very difficult moment in American race relations. You also have a very difficult moment, for example, in the pandemic, having killed more minorities as compared to other sort of thing in America. So I feel that the crisis of normative power is not new again. It's a cycle. It all depends on how badly America gets smeared in this battle for normative power. And I think what you are going to see in the election is not really a joint battle for upholding American normative power, but rather a battle for who is the better candidate to hold on normative American power. Let's say, who is going to really make America great again? you know, is it Trump or is it the other guy who is going to hold that beacon of light as far as American normative power is concerned? So I think that's going to be the battle between the two parties. And otherwise, you do have a longer sort of a sense of continuity as far as debates on American normative power is concerned. Quickly, because you mentioned about sanctions and the problem that Americans are going to face in the next election, in the next administration, is also that I believe that either is Myanmar or Iran, American, it's like sanctions has become a default American foreign policy tool. So anything happens, you don't know what to do, put sanctions. Anything happens, you don't know what to do, put sanctions. So sanctions is like that tool in the closet that they think can be useful for changing the behavior of any country in the world. So I think that's also one of the instrumental parts of American foreign policy tools that the successive administration is going to deal with, which is how do you deal with countries who don't behave as per your understanding of normative behavior in the international system. What are you going to do about it? I think that's a major question as far as the future of US foreign policy tool is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We seem to run out of time, but first of all, I just would like to thank NIICE and Water Policy Center for bringing us all together. I think it was a fantastic session, and at least I enjoyed this time. I just hope that we will keep in touch afterwards, and probably develop something together in the future. And again, thanks to organizers for bringing us all together. On this, I just would close the session. Thank you all the speakers, and again, we had great time together. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Distinguished chair, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, as we come to the end of this session, it is my great honor to propose a vote of thanks on behalf of NIICE-WPC. I would like to express our gratitude and sincere thanks to Professor Maxim Khomyakov for accepting our request to chair this session. A sincere thanks goes to all the speakers for delivering such a comprehensive and insightful presentation. We are honored to have all the speakers with us here today. We would like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academia, media, and different organizations. Last but not the least, I must mention a deep sense of appreciation for our audience who participated in the webinar and those who are watching us live. We are truly honored to have you all with us this morning and hope to stay connected with you in the future as well. I request all of you kindly join us for the next session. Thank you.